Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here in person and online. I just want to start off and thank everybody I see there's a lot of people online, wherever you are in the world, and however you've been impacted recently by the funding cuts by the US government. I just want to say, we're here for you. We are following this issue very closely. We are working on it. We'd love to hear from you if you've had programs that have not been terminated, that are still extended. We're trying to get a lay of the land of what programs, peace building, conflict prevention programs are still continuing. We know of a few, or we know of some, but we'd like to get a better handle on that as we continue our advocacy, especially with Congress. If you are not signed up for our policy alerts, please send us a note and do that. We send out now weekly policy alerts and continue to have member meetings. We're having one this Friday. Everybody is welcome to go over what's happening with the funding cuts and next steps. So I just wanted to put that out there for everyone so everybody knows. It's now so important that as a community, we work together and we collaboratively work together. So we are committed to that here at the Alliance for Peace Building, and no greater show of incredible evidence than the work that the Institute for Economics and Peace does, an incredible partner. The Global Terrorism Index briefing today, the findings are critical, and I say this every year when any of your work comes out. We know more now about, and we have such better data in the last 2 decades than, going back. When did IEP start?
2007, 2008.
2007, 2008. We know so much more now based on some of the incredible work that IEP has done. So you're launching the Global Terrorism Index, and it's a comprehensive study on the impact of terrorism, trends, patterns, and unfortunately, this year, like every other year, has found that violent extremism remains a persistent threat, and that the number of countries experiencing at least one terrorist incident increased from 58 to 66. The most since 2018. I'm going to let you get into more of this, the details and the trends. But we're not here just to talk about the problem. We want to hear about, and regardless of what cuts have happened, this problem is not going away. We can't fight our way out of it. We know drivers better. And we need to be able to have programs that are addressing the drivers of violent extremism. So this is so critical. We can't do that without this data. We do know that the violent extremism issue is resonating with those in the US government. So this is incredibly well-timed information. So I'm turning it over to you, Michael Collins, with the Institute for Economics for Peace, to give us more details.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Liz. And, I wish I could say that this was developed specifically with the recent funding freeze in mind. It's not. It's a report that, we've produced annually for the last 12 years. It's never necessarily pleasant to talk about these things, and obviously the timing is never great. But to the extent that it can, that it may provide information, we certainly hope that it's valuable. We do sort of more broadly as an institute do a variety of different studies around peace and conflict, where we also hope may serve a purpose during this time, including things like the Global Peace Index, for example, the original study on the effectiveness of peace building, trends in militarization, as well, So we very much hope that that kind of sort of data can contribute positively in that sense. And again, thank you for the partnership with the Alliance for Peace Building. We think incredibly highly of the work that all of you do in Washington, D.C. and beyond. Would like to jump kind of sort of straight into the topic in the interest of everyone's time, and perhaps just focusing initially on sort of what we call the definition of terrorism in a nutshell. Obviously, it's a contentious issue in itself. There's no real universal definition. The data set that we use uses this underlying sort of gateway methodology. So on the left-hand side, you see the definition. Point number one would be the systemic threat or use of violence, right? That would be a critical check mark, if you will. Number two, perpetrated by a non-state actor in this case. So one thing that I wanted to make clear is that we exclude forms of state violence in the Global Terrorism Index. Now, that is accounted more broadly in things like Global Peace Index or the Political Terror Scale and other forms of analysis, be it IEP or otherwise. But here we're focusing exclusively on non-state actors with the intention of communicating a political, religious, or ideological message to a group larger than the victim group. So this would currently exclude, for example, cartels in Mexico or organized crime gangs, be those in Haiti, or Ethiopia, South Africa, or elsewhere. There is, even with a relatively tight definition, there still continues to be a lot of gray areas, especially given the increase in conflict that we're seeing around the world. The terrorism index does include a large percentage of terrorist attacks on military targets and law enforcement targets, as well as civilians. But of course, there's always a kind of sort of a very gray area in between, terrorist attacks, insurgencies, and then broader forms of conflict. And we account for those on a case-by-case basis to the best degree that we can. One of the additional things that I suppose you could say sets the Global Terrorism Index apart is that we try and measure the impact of terrorism in a very limited way. And that is primarily by understanding or developing a better measure of the incidents and attacks that have occurred in sort of 5 years prior and treating those as kind of sort of a bucket. And the aim of that is, to the extent that we can, account for the sort of longer term emotional, social, and political impact that any individual terrorist attack may have, almost independently of its size. So we'd love to delve into kind of sort of, just to touch on briefly, this is a general map of terrorist incidents around the world. And through that methodology that you saw there, we would sort of convert it to this map that you see here, which sort of talks about the impact of terrorism more broadly. This is readily available on our website in interactive form. And before I forget, we've actually just very recently included a Peacebot, an AI assistant on our website. So if you have any questions about the GTI that are not answered here today, Peacebot will take a good stab at it. So jumping into the results and trends. So we actually saw that deaths from terrorism decreased slightly last year, but that is largely because of the very large terrorist attack that we saw last year in Israel. So taking that out, we see that terrorism deaths have more or less remained constant and have done so since 2018, approximately. The number of attacks has decreased by a small amount, 3% in this particular case. But what Liz alluded to, there's a number of countries that have recorded new terrorist incidences, 66 in particular, and 45 countries have deteriorated in their impact of terrorism over the same time. Now, something to note, and what we're going to end the presentation with today, is the very close correlation that exists between conflict and terrorism. And that will kind of sort of become evident, I feel, as and when we present the different countries, but it really kind of sort of stands to probably two key messages there. Number one, we expect to see an increase in conflict globally, even if it may not be major wars, such as the one in Ukraine and in Gaza. And secondly, we expect to see an increase in terrorism for exactly the same reasons, because of that strong correlation. So the four deadliest terrorist groups in 2024 were essentially the same ones as 2023. So we're talking about the Islamic State, we're talking about Jainim, which operates largely in the Sahel region, we're talking about the Taliban and Pakistan, and we're talking about Al-Shabaab. In conjunction, they killed 10% more people than in 2024. The Taliban in Pakistan in particular was the fastest growing organization, with significant increase in the number of deaths in Pakistan primarily. The Islamic State remained the world's deadliest terrorist group. and is active in more countries than it was last year, 22 in total. 7 countries currently in the worst 50, and that's a first in the Global Terrorism Index. Let me see if I can get them all. US, Canada, UK, France, Australia, and Sweden. And Germany, sorry, actually, Germany is the one, thank you, Brett. Germany is the one that ranks worst, currently ranked 34th, I believe. Interestingly, or that's probably the wrong term, but a large, if not all, of the deaths that we saw in the West were caused by what we would call sort of lone actors. And that's a bit of a difficult term to unpack, but to the extent that we're talking about it here, we're talking about attacks that are perpetrated without guidance and with a certain measure of self-radicalization. The worrying aspect about that is that lone actors or lone wolf attacks are significantly more likely to be successful, 3 times more likely, in fact. Zeroing in on the Sahel, which is currently the epicenter of terrorism and has been for the last 2 or 3 years, it accounts for over half of the deaths from terrorism globally. We will be unpacking kind of sort of the waning and waxing of Western and African influence, particularly in the countries most impacted by terrorism. One of which, of course, is Burkina Faso, which we mentioned before, currently the most impacted country by terrorism, accounting for 1,800 deaths globally. Although it did see a drop in attacks and in deaths last year. 20% of all deaths globally were in Burkina Faso, followed by Pakistan. So this is the first time in Pakistan that we've seen over 1,000 deaths since, again, going back to 2013, 2014, and an uptake in terrorist activity in Syria, largely related to the Islamic State. Now, just to clarify, these measures have got a cutoff date until December 2024. So recent events, be it in Germany, the United States, or alternatively in Syria, are not necessarily incorporated here. Niger and Pakistan had the largest increases in deaths, a lot of instability in Niger. And again, we'll go into that, I think, in the next slide. These are the most impacted countries by terrorism. All of these countries in conflict. 6 out of 10 of these countries are currently in sub-Saharan Africa. And Burkina Faso is the only country other than Iraq or Afghanistan that's been included in the top/bottom spot of the Global Terrorism Index. So as you can see, terrorism is very concentrated around the world. More than 85% is practically concentrated in some of the countries that you see here. We talked briefly about Burkina Faso and Pakistan. The DRC, along with Cameroon, are locations where the Islamic State is starting to play a relatively large role. Niger, the expansion of Jainim, for example, in particular, as well as Burkina Faso, and of course the Taliban in Pakistan as well, and a combination of both in Mali and also in Nigeria. So here's the increases. Now the situation of Niger is, it saw one of the largest deteriorations, but it also saw one of the largest improvements back in 2022. So it's been kind of sort of a radical reversion of fortunes. There's been a recent withdrawal of US troops and the sort of the regional air base there. That's by no means the reason. I mean, the reasons are very complex, potentially due to the fact that there are many warring factions and terrorist organizations that are essentially fighting each other, similar to what happened in Burkina Faso and Niger over the 2 years prior. All 3 of these countries have had coups over the last couple of years, whereas the situation, you could say, has somewhat stabilized, I suppose, in Burkina Faso and Mali, although they continue to have a considerable number of deaths, as you know. Niger is the one taking sort of the brunt of things at the moment, at least in terms of increases. Russia and Iran factored in here, but actually this is largely just 2 singular attacks, both perpetrated by the Khorasan chapter of the Islamic State. So we go back to 2007 with the Global Terrorism Index, and for the last 5 years, essentially, we've seen relatively little fluctuation in terrorism around the world. Large deteriorations, again, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Pakistan. And the improvements over this 5-year period in Afghanistan, partly due to withdrawing the Taliban from the counting in the Global Terrorism Index, because they're now the government in Afghanistan. Iraq has seen a 90% improvement in terrorism since 2007. So it's had ups and downs in between all of that. But counterterrorism measures, for the most part, have been functional. I think the big question, one of the reasons we're here today, is then what, right? And how can we continue to ensure support and make sure that when it comes to either a military intervention or any form of intervention, that we continue to understand that the building of resilience that's necessary is unfortunately a long-term affair that requires long-term commitment. So in the West, we had actually seen a progressive improvement in terrorism, or reduction in terrorism, I should say, since its peak in 2017, but it's actually increased by 32 to 52 incidents this year, though the actual number of deaths has decreased ever so slightly. We did see a significant shift, especially in the 2 months after the Gaza war, in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic sentiment. This is FBI data that's not incorporated into the index, but we did see, for example, in terms of terrorist incidents in both Canada and the US, a 50-50 split. In other words, in terms of anti-Semitic attacks being half of the terrorist incidents measured. There's a bit less data when it comes to Islamophobic attacks. So the Islamic State, again, deadliest terrorist, and this is kind of sort of breakout of all of the terrorist groups. My apologies to those in the room. It's a very small slide that we're looking at right now, but you should be able to see that yellow line there. That's the Islamic State, evidently not as deadly as it once was, but continues to be a significant force, especially because of its transnational capability, whereas the likes of JNIM, for example, are much more regionally focused, but have also seen significant growth, as has, again, the TTP. So just to put things in context, as we always try and do, that top sliver on the right, on the top that you can hardly see, is actually the West. So as you can see, a significant amount of terrorism around the world happens in other countries. The Sahel is that gray area that you see there that has progressively and significantly increased. It's leaking now, as we know, into coastal West Africa, one of the core areas of focus of the Global Fragility Act, and highlighting here perhaps the decrease in conflict, in terrorist activity that we're seeing in Iraq. So we're just going to focus in on kind of sort of three specific areas before handing it over to our fine colleagues. The first one about homegrown lone wolf terrorism. Very few attacks, at least recent ones, in the West are carried out by a particular group. You know, TBD, for example, the recent attack in New Orleans, how that will ultimately be classified in the Global Terrorism Index. This was someone who actually radicalized in an extremely short period of time. Looking back to 2002, for example, it could take over a year and a half to either self-radicalize or alternatively to be recruited by a terrorist organization. That has changed significantly in recent years. Many reasons, which I think are sort of largely intuitive. Again, there's relatively little data around this, but certainly the literature points to a general disaffection with society, a lack of meaning and purpose, and by extent, the ability that a terrorist incident or attack may provide that meaning or purpose, whereas otherwise missing. And one of the ongoing challenges, of course, is that there are now more and more challenges for people to sort of self-radicalize, and we're seeing that through the data as well. So an increasing number of terrorist incidents in the data sets that we consult are marked as indetermined or are not sort of marked as a group, and are often a mix of different ideologies. So they incorporate aspects from the left, they incorporate aspects from the right, and it's so difficult to unpack to the extent in which they need to be classified as undetermined. Now, the number of attackers in the West in particular is increasing in terms of it being essentially performed by children, right? So 42% according to the Home Office in the UK, and 20% in Europe were perpetrated by terror attacks, including the planned attack at the Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. Which, of course, all of this makes it significantly more difficult for counterintelligence agencies, counterterrorism agencies or intelligence services to uncover. Minimal footprint in terms of the fact that there's no communication back and forth between different groups, between different individuals, so that becomes a lot more difficult to intercept. It's inexistent. And also there's no financing flows in these particular instances, so you really can't pursue that line of research either. So here's a graph kind of sort of elucidating to that. The dark blue that you see here is what we would classify as lone wolf attacks. And as you can see, it's increased considerably over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is specific to jihadist plots, no particular reason other than the fact that this data is readily available. And this is in relation to things perpetrated by a single actor. So for example, the case in New Orleans, nonetheless tied to the group in some way, or alternatively organized in a more concerted fashion by the group. 3 times more likely to succeed when it comes to being perpetrated by a single actor. Maybe just to end primarily on the Sahel, because again, it continues to be the epicenter of terrorism globally, and there continues to be a lot of international and geopolitical focus here, currently accounting for over 50% of all deaths globally. I mentioned sort of the withdrawal of the US support, obviously the increase of Russian security support as well. 3 major countries within this kind of sort of group had coups recently. We definitely think that there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the exchange of international partners. Obviously, the withdrawal of France, the withdrawal of the EU military partnership as well. We think that perhaps it's less about who's in charge or who is supporting and when, and it's more a case of when the cracks are appearing. Because, for example, a lot of the instability that we saw immediately after the coups in Burkina Faso and Mali, very similar to what we're seeing now in Niger. And it's kind of like when there is instability within the country, when the government is internally focusing on resolving their issues, and before counterterrorism efforts can start up again, we see a significant and quick expansion of the likes of the Islamic State and Jainim. But there's many, many complex issues to unpack. And again, I think that this is a reason why we'd love to open up this discussion today. Yes, poor governance and elements of corruption as well, but historical conflicts are and ethnic conflicts are in many occasions leveraged and utilized by extremist groups to be able to advance their particular agenda, elements of ecological degradation, and from a geopolitical and as well national perspective, of course, significant natural resources within a number of these countries as well, accounting for part of that. So significant gold reserves in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, again, the 3 countries largely most impacted by terrorism. Niger has got a large resource of uranium, which historically has gone to the EU. And the number of attacks on gold mines has increased significantly over the last 5 years. Just to clarify, these wouldn't, they may or may not be directly linked to extremist groups. A number of them are, but I guess one of the points that we're making in the report is that oftentimes there are criminal groups operating that essentially these extremist groups are licensed to operate. So they would provide protection, they would provide security for these organized crime groups. Overall, terrorism deaths are up 10 times since 2019. At that time, I think very few of us, including IEP, would have kind of sort of seen the expansion of terrorism within this particular region. So Jainim has become very much the dominant group nationally, to the cost at a certain extent of the Islamic State, particularly the Islamic State of West Africa, although, again, the Islamic State continues to be the deadliest organization with significant transnational reach. This is just touching on the geopolitics ever so slightly. So this is a measure of sentiment analysis. It's a data set, and there's a number of these that enable you to be able to look at the sentiment in the average day of news. It tells you what are the number of articles that are talking negatively or positively about another particular country. Now, of course, some of this can be engineered and often is. And some of it can be organic as well. But independently, as you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, there's significant deterioration in attitudes towards France, a former colonial power, throughout the sort of the Sahel region. And interestingly, comes before the coups that I mentioned before. This is the approval of the United States and Russia in the Sahel. Interestingly, if we look at sort of the pack in the middle here, these ones here, and I'm just going to read them out for the ones for the people in the room. So Chad, Mauritania, Guinea, Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Niger. This is since 2019. The United States and Russia both continue to poll relatively well. At least they poll better than they once did. But critically, in the countries most impacted by terrorism in that region, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, with the exception of Gambia, that doesn't think particularly highly of the US or Russia, the approval ratings of Russia are positive, whereas the ones of the United States are negative. Now, again, in all candidness, this probably has a cutoff also of 2014, so I don't think necessarily that it would be the current administration that one would.
I mean, 2024.
Would want, yes, sorry, would want to point to, but it does speak about distinct discrepancies here by what is potentially needed, thought about, perceived in a lot of these countries most impacted by terrorism. A lot of this we've already talked about, so with your permission, I'm broadly going to skip. Just to note that when we talk about the Islamic State, we're talking about the overall networks, provinces and affiliates, including the Islamic State Khorasan chapter. Syria obviously continues to be of ongoing concern. US military bases in Syria. Iraq has seen again this large decline in terrorism. But looking at things in Syria, one wonders, how perennial that is. This we've also talked about already, and probably just to note that actually the death toll from the Islamic State in particular would probably be significantly higher if some of the most recent plots had not been foiled. Now, bear in mind that's 24 plots here, but we probably in the open intelligence community only hear about half, if not a quarter, of the overall plans that were potentially foiled. So continues to be a significant risk. This here is kind of sort of the overall footprint of the organization in particular, and this is ISK particular propaganda over the last couple of years. So currently producing content in essentially over 9 languages now. And as you can see, gradually increasing that capacity, leveraging machine learning technology among other things, and technology more broadly. Most recently, for example, you see these yellow bits here. That is the use of Tajik in propaganda. And of course, you may remember that it was Tajikistan citizens who are responsible for the recent ISK attack in Moscow at the tail end of last year. Just to close on the context, we talked about the correlation between conflict and terrorism. A couple of additional things that we noted in the Global Peace Index that I think would be relevant here is that the number of conflicts globally that are ending in a victory has significantly declined, either a strong victory in favor of the state or alternatively the non-state actor. Also, the number of conflicts that are resolved with a peace agreement significantly declined over the last 50 years. This and the fact that significantly more countries are becoming involved in conflicts beyond their borders makes us think that the amounts of conflicts globally are going to continue to increase and certainly not going to be resolved, leading in many instances to what we perceive to be will be essentially an increase in terrorism. So all of this kind of sort of leads me to hand it back to Liz and our kind colleague Kemi Elbenyodu, who's joining us online.
Okay, so thank you. Lots of incredibly interesting data. Kemi, can you hear us, Kemi?
Yes, I can.
Okay, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. Kemi is the founder and executive director of Partners West Africa and Nigeria. She's also a board member at AFP. So we're thrilled to have you and your incredible expertise. So you have incredible experience in security, governance, criminal justice reform, NGO management in Nigeria and West Africa. So can you tell us a little bit what you're seeing there, and what, especially in the Sahel, what is driving this? What is driving this increase?
Thank you. I mean, some of these issues are perennial issues that we've had with us within the Sahel for years that haven't been properly handled. So, for example, the weak governance structure that we see across some of the states, presence of government or government infrastructure within the states' capitals. But the farther you go away from the state capital, it looks like there are no structures, no governance structures in place. Closely related to that are ethnic tensions, intercommunal conflicts, either hinged on religion. So it could be ethnic, it could be religious conflicts being driven amongst same people, similar languages, different culture. Ecological degradation has compounded this. The lack of trust in government and government agencies, particularly the security agencies. So it's a mixed basket, really. Marginalization of people or groups based on whoever it is that is in the driver's seat of power or governance at a particular point in time. So it's lack of inclusivity, impunity when it comes to the rule of law. Some elements feel they are above the law. Hijacking of state infrastructure. I mean, I can go on and on.
Yeah. Okay. Is there something, you're seeing this uptick, is there something that you would say is particularly problematic in this region? And
First
then more
is
importantly, hold on, Kemi, one more thing. And then more importantly, what are some of the key programmatic successes to prevent violent extremism, reduce it? Are you, what is there something that you can pinpoint to?
I would say key of all this is the element of the disparity between the people and the government, right? So there's a big divide, there's a big gap between those in power and the citizens they are seeking to lead or rule. Either a disconnect based on the fact that the administration or the government does not understand what the needs and the issues of the people are, or they choose to ignore it. In recent times, we can also look at, if we're looking at the regional platform now and you're moving away from each state, is the alliance with the breakaway fraction of the Burkina, Mali, Niger, and the element of alliance with certain foreign powers, which is anti-West, which speaks fundamentally for some of us to the democratic ethos for which we have been aligned to, and which is what we're using in building the social cohesion, the principle behind social cohesion, nation building. I'd also look at the element of transparency and accountability. Yeah, so you have systems of government that are not accountable to the people, systems of government that is not inclusive. People don't know how it's run. People don't know. Elections don't make sense to us. Let me just put it that plain. Elections don't make sense to us. So because what people feel they voted at the ballot is not what it seemingly comes out at the end of the day, which has led to series of coups and various coups, upturning of government, in recent times, upturning of government using the courts. But if we look at interventions that have worked, trying to look at what the mirage of issues are, interventions that have worked are interventions that are peace building, local peace building efforts that are driven, that are community centered, citizen centered. And we look at initiatives that also foster social cohesion. So we're having dialogues, facilitating dialogues between state communities and at times the militant or insurgent groups. Because again, if you have opportunity of speaking with some members of the insurgent groups, you'll find that their issues against the state are hinged on some of the things we're also complaining about. But they've just felt so marginalized and so disconnected that they feel that the best way to address it is to take up arms against the state. Because once they had been pushed to the extreme, that's the way they feel they can address some of these issues. Programs that also address elements of governance, vocational training, addressing youth-based issues, challenges that the youth are facing within the society and within the country are also programs that have worked. So alternative to education, for example, life skills, vocational training programs that give young people an opportunity to earn an income, because these are part of the narratives for recruitment for some of the extremist groups. Because the Sahel is basically religious driven. So moderation, programmed intervention that looks at moderate religious leaning are also programs that have worked over time. I'll say in recent times, what we have seen is also that activities that have engaged traditional and religious leaders have also been successful. Traditional religious leaders are community gatekeepers. In some time in some past, we were not engaging them because we were seeing them as part of the problem. However, the more we start to engage with them and educate and enlighten them, you find that they can be positive change makers and ambassadors for local peace building efforts, social cohesion, and also amplifying the voices of their people, because they also tend to have engagement with the government structures. So governance initiative vis-a-vis that are addressing the root causes of violent extremism are things we've seen that have worked.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, I want to ask you one last question before I move over to Michael, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. You know that the US government has, first they put a stop work order, then they have terminated many programs. In fact, Nick, what was the 83% of USAID programs, and about, I think, half of the State Department programs. The majority of or the vast majority of programming from USAID that we're seeing that continued was health and humanitarian assistance. So are you seeing any of impacts on the ground now on, you know, what's happening, or have you heard more? Because I know you work regionally as well. What are you hearing in terms of, you know, the multiplier effect, or, you know, what's your take on what's happening in your region?
You know, like I said, that some of the interventions that most of us on this side work on are the soft sell, right? On the side of government, most times to address some of the issues the main issue we're talking about here is the militarized approach to it. So most of the groups we engage with are groups that are working on the governance, on the peace building elements. And what we have seen is that there's a break. It's like there's a halt. So all the gains that we have made, the tractions we've made, that we've even gained with building trust, aligning and facilitating conversation or dialogues between state actors and non-state actors, all are, it stopped, basically, it stopped. Some of my colleagues, and similar to us, I mean, was last week I got a call from some people in Katsina State requesting we assist them facilitate a security summit, and you say, oh, the state should be able to do that. But you need a trusted ally that would bring state and bring non-state actors together to talk about the issues of banditry, to talk about the issues of lack of access, kidnapping, and the impact of, because Katsina shares border with Niger, right? So what's the element of the disconnect between ECOWAS and Niger right now? For those that know how our borders are, some people will say the borders are porous, but the borders are an offshoot of the colonial history. So you have same families living across the same border. It's the same family, they speak the same language, but across borders. So who is a trusted ally? The state government of Nigeria, the Katsina state cannot invite them. Neither can the state in Niger invite them, but organizations like P1 could facilitate this interaction, and they would come and there would be conversation. But all of these are at a halt. Vocational training programs in some of the border communities at a halt, legal aid assistance at a halt, So it's basically, and what we fear the most is that with time, things might just go back to what it used to be or worse than what it used to be, because you're now creating a good opportunity for the narrative to change, particularly for those that have been pushing for allegiance to other world powers. I mean, we saw it in Niger, we saw it in we've seen it in Niger, we've seen it in Burkina, we've seen it in Mali, and we're talking about the influence of the people now, not the states, on each other, right? So you never can tell how that, nature abhors vacuum. And once there's a vacuum, something needs to fill it. What is going to fill it is what we don't know. And we definitely know who we don't want to fill it, right? But again, nature abhors vacuum. Colleagues have lost their jobs in some organizations. Some organizations have had to close up, so people are struggling, really.
I'm so sorry. And thank you for your incredible dedication and work. So Michael, like looking just past this analysis of these threats from violent extremism and terrorism, what do you see are the main recommendations coming out of the report, and how do you see it given this termination of assistance that's been working specifically on these problems? How are you guys seeing this right now? And I'm sorry to I know you're like,
Easy question.
Well, the way we present ourselves.
give us the answer.
We present ourselves as the data wonk for the policy experts, precisely so we don't have to answer these kinds of questions. I mean, a couple of things. Look, invariably, there are a number of countries around the world that are impacted by conflict, as well as terrorism. I mean, ultimately, the appetite of any nation to intervene as much or as little is just going to come down to, national factors and geopolitical ambitions. So I don't think in any instance it's a case of bashing anyone or any effect. Probably one of the core things here is just how long, and leaving any form of sort of external intervention or support, be it financial or security wise, how long resilience takes to build. And it's kind of sort of a very broad term. I know in this case we produce relatively strict metrics, I suppose you could say, on resilience, based largely on where conflict happens and where it doesn't around the world. But that resilience takes a long time to build. And unfortunately, it's kind of the first thing also to be kind of sort of impacted if there is the outbreak of major conflict as well. So, perhaps just sort of a realization that if we are trending towards a more militarized world, that is going to, conceivably include an increase in conflict, potentially, even though there's very little appetite, the involvement of US troops abroad and military investment abroad and at home, that there is a consequence of that, and that invariably it has a long tail. The United States and many other nations spent 20 years in Afghanistan, and the moment that the door from the plane closed, things reverted to essentially how they were. That's not to say that that is a good or a bad thing. What I'm saying is that the security only aspect is very limited. It's punctual. Sure, it can be effective as long as it lasts. So that ability to be able to support broader development, a lot of the governance components, particularly local governance that Kemi was referring to before, participatory and inclusive political processes, from our perspective, are absolutely key. In fact, they kind of sort of formed the prior analysis on the effectiveness of peace building, which is something that we very much hope to update in the short term.
Okay, so one last question. What are the findings in the report that most concern you? And what are the ones that gave you some hope?
Well, the thing is, not more or less than last year. And the factor is that terrorism continues to be a significant threat globally. And we do take this as an opportunity to highlight instances of terrorism and conflict more broadly that we don't tend to hear about in the headlines. So to the extent that we can achieve that through presentations like this, we can be more happy, despite the fact that we're reporting somewhat horrific news. I mean, overall, it's how much terrorism and conflict we're willing to kind of sort of take in the world. I understand that these are incredibly difficult and complex topics. In the Global Peace Index this year, and sorry, this is a bit of a plug, but it's a relevant question, we do plan, at least on highlighting, forming a ranking of countries based on their levels a ranking of conflicts based on conceivably the ease with which they can be resolved. So there's going to be a whole lot of kind of sort of things to unpack there. But the idea is that, yes, there's a whole bunch of really, really tough and horrible stuff that we can't deal with, but potentially there's some stuff that we can. And what would be the most practical actions for policymakers, alternatively civil society, to make progress in that space.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, I'm gonna open it up. Nick's gonna help me here on questions from you all, and especially online as well.
Yeah, awesome. So maybe we can start with a few questions in the room, and I've been compiling questions in the chat as well. Yes, if you could just introduce yourself as well before that.
Sure. My name is Deborah, and you guys don't know me, but you know of me because of the contributions that I have made in the financial services space. So I'm here today specifically because this topic was on terrorism. And I want to go back to the comment that Michael made about how we're trending toward a more militarized world. And I would argue that we are already full-fledged there, right? How do we say something softer than we are there when we live in a country that has 24-hour warrantless surveillance? I don't know who is tracking domestic terrorism, but speaking as somebody who is considered a dissident and is receiving terrorist treatment, when I look at this map, and it doesn't look like their impact of terrorism is significant in the US. And I'm like, when do we start looking at the terrorism that is happening domestically, and then, weighing that appropriately to what is happening against the rest of the world? Because we can't have a surveillance state and not we can't have a surveillance state and not know about all of the abuses related to like a 702, and then still say that it's not a terrorist state. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Who is tracking what is happening from a terrorist perspective in the US, especially as they are weaponizing this label of terrorist, particularly for dissidents?
So why don't we just really quickly, your definition of terrorism? Let's make sure that we are understanding what that definition is. I know you said it in the beginning, but let's go back
And that
to
was
it.
a recurring question as well for folks who are.
And,
Absolutely.
well, and also just let me say a couple of things on this. I know the Department of Homeland Security in the US was looking at violent extremism in the US. That's one place to go. But also in terms of, I think what you were referring to is the increase in security. You know, when we had the democracy forum here, what was it called? The democracy, what was it?
Summit for Democracy?
Thank you, the Summit
Yeah.
for Democracy. You know, one of the things, and especially like in coastal West Africa and African leaders, they were all asking for more military support. That's what they were asking for. I was just at the OECD last week. Europe has put forth, was it like 800 million or something? Sorry, how much?
800 billion.
800 billion, thank you, for new security sector. And so it was one of the themes that came up at the OECD is that this incredible push for increase in security, military, and how was the peace building conflict prevention field going to re-engage on that? Because we know one of the biggest drivers of violent extremism, terrorism is human rights abuses by military forces is one of a big driver, I should say. So there, I put all of this in context.
Thanks, Liz. Very happy to revisit the definition. Maybe I'll start, Deborah, by doing my best to answer your question. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that the Global Terrorism Index doesn't take into account. One of the things that we try and do, though, is to kind of sort of have a standardized definition that would apply to all countries equally. There are a number of issues inside the United States and other countries that are tracked in other forms of IUP reports. The Global Peace Index is a good example of that. So, you know, the United States has got one of the highest homicide rates in the world, one of the, sorry, not one of the highest, high homicide rate, one of the highest incarceration rates in the world as well. Instances of political terror more broadly, globally, also is factored in the Global Peace Index. But here we're exclusively talking about non-state actors rather than national or even local governments. We're talking about the systematic threat or use of violence, again, by a non-state actor, with the intention of communicating a political or ideological message. So it would not include, for example, for purely economic gain. And a core aspect of it as well is that, yes, there is a potential victim to a terrorist incident, although again, there are many which are not fatal, but the idea is to communicate a message broader to the group, broader than the victims itself.
Instill fear.
Yes,
So-
with the aim of
so
changing their behavior.
It's not just a mass shooting.
Yeah.
It's a political act.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so maybe we'll take 2 questions in the room and then we'll jump to some questions from folks online.
I just wanted to say.
If you could
if
just
you're-
introduce yourself as far.
Sorry, Tammy, I run a program called Priority Sustainable Counterterrorism at New Heights. I think just if you're looking for more events that are more mass shooting events, there are a couple of resources if you're interested in that. Secure Community Network, that's largely anti-Semitic event tracking, but that's more US. And then terrorism and targeted violence at Maryland, they just started that, which is a broader than the definition that GTI uses. But I just wanted to, I think your responses, Michael, for what are the recommendations and solutions in this upcoming index that your IEP is planning on doing on what might be areas might be easier to fix these kinds of conflicts and threats. I think the GTI, especially 2025, there's so much opportunity for researchers and analysis, especially on like peripheries to these zones and on activity that runs out. So I think that's just my plug. That's something that we're doing, and there's just so much more that can be contributed to the research analysis space on like what are the points that can be moved forward. So I just really liked that. that comment that you had on, all right, this is conflict, this is terrorism threat, but maybe start pointing out some specific examples of this is where we can make some movement. So I just really thought that was a really nice contribution. I love the focus as well.
The pressure's on now.
Yeah. No pressure.
Yeah, and maybe we'll take your question as well, then Michael, you can
Yeah.
answer both.
So there are some similarities. Louis Rasmussen with Strategic Capacity Group. I just want to say first, I appreciate the work you all do. It is very interesting and very helpful. And as you drill down, I'd be very curious because the data sets you have longitudinally, and granted, we're talking, a decent amount of time. But with that in mind, have you gone back and crosswalked your different studies? And so you look at the state of conflict, you look at the state of terrorism, and then crosswalking deliberately year over year in terms of the peace building side. Taking a look at causes, drivers, escalation rates, de-escalation rates, and then correlating, if you will, against some of the larger peace efforts,
Yeah.
Major interventions, whether they are state-sponsored or peace building community sponsored, local, regional. I think you have the data sufficient to do that, and it would be fascinating.
So thank you, Lewis, and we took a stab at that. It was quite some time ago. So we definitely, this is work that we'd like to not only update but also expand upon. And that was the sort of the effectiveness of peace building work. It was kind of sort of limited in this particular case. It was limited to Rwanda. And one of the core challenges that we found, which really we probably still continue to find today, is kind of sort of the definition of what we include and what we don't include in peace building, right? Because it goes all the way from hard security to the tail end of the development spectrum. So we try to factor that in as best as
consistent year over year.
That's absolutely right, and being able to do that in a globally comparable way. Interestingly, we're just about to produce a paper on ODA, which we thought maybe be particularly relevant to the times, and similar definitional issues as well. So the answer is we'd like to do it a lot more, and that is exactly the sort of the kind of work that we do. It's just a question of kind of sort of evolving that thinking, and one of the reasons I think why these sessions are so useful.
But it'll be interesting is given the stop of funding of US government programs who were doing a lot of this work. It would be interesting to take a snapshot of this year to see what happens at the end of the year.
Yeah, agreed.
Interesting, if not tragic.
Right.
Yeah.
I have just one question, if that's all right.
But let's take, I don't know if you responded to Tammy's question, Michael,
I'm not sure if it was a comment.
more of a comment.
It was a call to fix the world in the next year's report.
Yeah. So let's go through some questions that were online and then so I'm actually going to take host prerogative and ask a question of my own first, sorry. But I was really interested at your stat on how the radicalization period has shortened a lot in recent years. And I'm curious if you have any data on why that is happening. I mean, I can make some educated guesses on social media algorithms and things like that. So I just wanted to pose that, but then two other questions. So somebody asked, when you were talking about the sentiment analysis between Sahel and France, also between the Sahel and US and Russia, they were curious to learn a bit more about your methodology for how you conduct that sentiment analysis, if it's text analysis. So kind of a methodology question. There was also a question for on the release of the report, are you, and I know this is a public facing event, so you may not be able to fully answer the question, but have you been socializing the report with any, policymakers on the Hill, any folks with the administration? How has the receptivity been to that? Are there any parts you think that are resonating most with policymakers? So I think with those three questions, we'll take one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Nick. So on the radicalization, yes, for us too, it's going to be it's an educated guess, and it would be no better than It's an educated guess. So it's not something that we have found significant data for. It's something that overall the literature is pointing to this particular point. So we don't have specific data on that overall reduction that we can track on an annual basis. In relation to question number 2, the sentiment data. So this is the integrated conflict early warning system, the underlying data set that we use. There's another one called GDELT, and there's another one now called Polecat. And all 3 of these tools use very similar methodologies, which is basically a scraping of news articles originating from the country and a machine, learning driven analysis of whether that sentiment is positive or negative towards a country. Now, if you look at any individual articles, there can be correct or incorrect kind of sort of classifications, but the idea here is what you're looking at thousands and thousands of different articles over time. So that provides you kind of sort of a good modicum of sentiment towards one country or another. And then in relation to the last question, I'm sorry, Nick, was
on the socialization to report with policymakers, folks in the Hill.
So we haven't actually done the Hill yet. We just came from the Pentagon. I mean, I think everyone is kind of sort of very, very open to things at the moment, and definitely asking a lot of hard questions.
Right.
And I think that that's no different from the current administration either. I mean, I think that the current administration is taking radical action in many, many different ways, but I think it's also to do something while they're thinking about something.
Right.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you. So your question.
Hi, my name is Charlene. I'm a master's student at UNC. I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow, and thank you for the talk. I had a very basic question. I think it's partially answered in the last question that you answered, but so I wanted to understand, going back to the definition of what is terrorism, there are a lot of hate crimes in India that have increased against ethnic minorities, for example, Muslims, by cow vigilante groups that is very specific to the Indian context of religion, and there's caste. And like from the definition I read, it would ideally fit perfectly. But I'm just wondering, when you're actually sifting through data, are you looking for the word terrorism or terrorist attack while figuring if that is an actual terror attack or it comes under the definition of terrorism? So that's something I was kind of curious about. Yeah.
So in part, yes, but that would also, in terms of kind of sort of like the benchmark words that the terrorism tracker would have to run against, terrorism or terrorist attack would definitely be within there, but it would be much broader as well. So simply the word attack would already be a flag for the team to kind of sort of, look at victim, group, and of course, kind of sort of the listed. So we currently include about 140 different groups in the Global Terrorism Index. So it is quite widespread, including a number of different groups in India and the region as well. So I'd say yes, but that would just be one of the sort of the words, and would not necessarily need to be to the exclusion of anything either. If that word didn't appear, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be picked up in the Global Terrorism Index.
Okay. I asked because there was a publication in India that was actually trying to track hate crimes that was eventually shut down. And then, so the government basically doesn't collect the data on hate crimes, or doesn't distinguish that as separate as any other crime in the National Crime Records Bureau. So I was just wondering, how do we color that sort of data?
It's horribly hard. And I'm not saying that we do a fantastic job at it either. I mean, it's more just that it's a really, really gray area. So again, we try and stick as closely as we can to that overall definition, because fundamentally definitions across the world are so different.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go just a second. Just 2 questions for online. So Kemi, if you're there still, actually the question for you, when you were talking about the problems that you see in the Sahel region behind the drivers of violent extremism, it seems like there are lots of different strategies you need to address those varying drivers. And currently, it seems like there's just not enough money behind them. You don't have the resources to achieve kind of the scale and the sustainability that you need. Do you think that the variety of remedies needed weakens the case for development aid to prevent or mitigate VE? Or what do you think, development aid should prioritize amongst the very different kind of drivers of violent extremism in the region?
I think depending on the mandate or the interest of the development aid, it's not either or. I'm of the school of thought that support is meant to show what is possible and what is doable. That government and other national stake actors or interested parties within the country could layer on and take forward. So invariably, it's a pilot, it's a test. For example, when we facilitate dialogues, from the part of government, there could be the resistance with the mindset that they wouldn't come to the table to have this conversation with us. However, with skills, facilitation skills, negotiation skills, you can get the most obstinate person to be on the table, mindful of how the interaction goes and how the communication is open and transparent and respectful. You know, things can get, situations get resolved. And I'll give an example. There's a project here in Nigeria where women were the lead to negotiate with the bandits on the need for them to access their farms and harvest so that they can feed their children and sustain their families. Initially, everybody felt it was not doable, but it was doable because they listened to them, so the approach also matters. Anything that builds on existing structures where it's possible, I would say that's where resources should be concentrated. Thank you.
You had a question. I'm probably going to repeat it after you ask, just because you're a little far away from the microphone, but go ahead.
Okay, I'm Mel Hardy from the Carter School for Peace, and to Kemi's point, she mentioned that so much focuses on social cohesion, but social cohesion without social mobility is a very difficult thing to kind of manage in national development activity. And I would say like the global, GTI and GPI are both bookends to what I think those of us in the peace building arena, we need to kind of figure out, do better with the pathing toward honest broker institutions that can support peace building on the ground, despite the lack of resources that you just mentioned. And then really, it's really difficult without enough. There's enough resources in the world, but focused on conflict parties of longstanding, the post-colonial era, where we are. It's very difficult.
Thank you.
Nick, hold on. Are there any other questions online?
Yeah, I'm
Sorry, I just want to get to people online.
Yes, so there was one question on the linkages or correlations that you're seeing in your research to kind of authoritarianism, right? And or dictatorship and the potential resulting increase of terrorist or extremist activity in those nations. And this comes from Jen Ullman, who was formerly with MSI, talking about the state of affairs in the US. The watch list is growing of contexts around the world where that could, worsen. So, and she talked about, impacts in Southeast Asia as well, for example. So do you think that's a central finding of the report? And I know it's a little maybe beyond the scope of some of your data, but looking also to the year ahead next year.
Yeah, I mean, maybe beyond the scope of the GTI, but a couple of things there. It's definitely something that we look at quite closely in the Global Peace Index. And of course, Southeast Asia is in the headlines today, right, with the arrest of Duterte.
Yes.
Which interestingly, if you look at the Philippines, for example, in the Global Peace Index, it's actually improved significantly, largely on the back of that crackdown. But and similarly for say El Salvador. But the question is, and this goes back to this kind of sort of idea of providing a security situation, but not necessarily one in which there is then the social mobility and freedoms that one would need to be able to develop into what is ultimately a more peaceful and prosperous society. In other words, to be able to maintain your ranking in the global peace index. And invariably, what we see in the Global Peace Index is that authoritarian regimes tend to be less peaceful in nature. So we do see a strong correlation between levels of democracy versus authoritarianism and different measures of peacefulness as well.
Can I ask just one thing in that? Do you track countries that are sliding into autocracy or countries that are sliding into democracy?
So who is it that does that? We don't do it directly ourselves. Oh, it's actually the EIU. I think. The Economist Intelligence Unit develops a good report on that we often sort of overlay with our own data to actually develop that comparison related to authoritarian.
There's also the IDEA annual report, and then there's the Freedom in the World Index as well. Yeah. So we're at about the 75-minute mark, so I think it's time if we want to wrap it up. But Liz, do you have any closing remarks you want to give?
No, it's just, I mean, well, besides the fact how important this data is, it's going to be really important. I know, Nick, you brought up the fact that we need to do some work on the Hill in terms of policy work on this. Especially as the budget is being decided.
Yeah, in the next 4 days.
In the next 4 days. And you know, in terms of how we rebuild programming in this area, I think the issue around, Louis, what you discussed around us monitoring where we're seeing any trends in countries where high violent extremism, and Kemi talked about this too, and the impact of programs being shut down is going to be really important this year. So I think that that's a really critical piece for us to be building, and it's not just the US, the UK just announced a cut as well.
Germany.
Yeah, most likely.
Belgium.
Yeah, the Netherlands. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, exactly.
Widespread trend.
So it really is a widespread trend. And at the same time, you're seeing military budgets go up. So I think that, again, this information is so incredible, but we have to use it. We have to use it with policy folks. We have to use it to track what we're seeing, especially this year. So once again, you know how much I love data. We are grateful for all the work that you're doing. We are grateful for all of you. We know this is a really difficult time. Like I said, we're here, the Alliance is here. And we're here to support you all, you know, with the work that you're doing, that you're able to still do. And please know we're here. I know, Michael, you are available also to, you know, to ask questions and to dig in more on this. And I know you'll probably have some people who want to talk to you after as well. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.